I'm delighted to be here today with all of you. It's rare that I'm in Limpopo, the best of times, and certainly not under COVID, and I'm delighted to be a part of your Congress. I'm going to say a few words about my organization and what I do, and then go on to talk about the state of the country and what I think business should do. So, the Center for Development and Enterprise is an unusual organization. We've been called a national resource that's paid for by business and private philanthropies. And our job is to think very hard about national challenges and that determine our prospects for growth and jobs. So we look at things like youth unemployment and what we should do about it, the quality of our education system and how to dramatically improve it, and the growth strategy that the country has. We try and influence government and business, media, and other important influencers throughout our society to think about the key challenges we face as honestly and frankly as possible, and then to think even harder about what we do about them. We have what you could call convening power. We can get people from different perspectives in a room or on a Zoom platform, and we can encourage them to listen to each other and to learn from each other and try and see where the other person sits and how we can find common ground to move South Africa forward. We also have a wide network of international experts who bring a very important new dimension to how to think about South Africa's big challenges and what to do about them. So just to give you a feel of the kind of issues that we work on, our chairman likes us to reduce mountains of research and analysis and debate to T-shirt slogans. So let me give you a few of those. South Africa spends too much time making the top of society blacker rather than the bottom of society better. This country compensates the poor for their exclusion rather than working night and day to include them. South Africa needs jobs for the workforce we actually have, not the highly skilled workforce we wish we had. In our view, an unskilled, low-wage job is a lot better as a first step than no job at all. And lastly, South Africa cannot be anti-business and expect to get growth or to deal with poverty. Now, I don't have to tell anyone here today what deep trouble this country is in. We really cannot go on as we are. We have the world's deepest unemployment rate. Before COVID, around 10 million people. Now, as we speak, at least 11 and 11.5 million people. We're a complete global outlier. We have a fiscal crisis. We spend more than we have. And our debt costs are now the fastest growing item on the country's budget. Our economy is stagnant. Even before COVID, it shrank -7% last year, -7%. And yes, we'll grow something this year, I hope. But to get back to where we were in 2019 is going to take until at least 2023. And in the meanwhile, the population grows and fiscal challenges continue. We have skilled people leaving the country. And basically, we don't have a compelling story about how this country is going to become much more prosperous much more inclusive, and build a future and hope for everybody. We don't have that now. So we can't go on as we are. Now, late last year, the president announced an economic recovery and recovery strategy for the country. This was after a year in which everybody, I think the only growth industry that South Africa had for most of 2020 was in the development of plans, proposals for what to do during and post-COVID to recover. The president's plan is, of course, the most important. And let me say a few words about this. This plan is built on a few essential pillars: industrialization, infrastructure, energy, reforms for growth, and employment stimulus. The problem is that although the president says he wants to ease the cost of doing business in South Africa, his own plan will add many more regulations for businesses and for firms because he wants to industrialize through localization. Sounds good. Who could be opposed to that? But in effect, this is an anti-export strategy. And we're in favor of making this a much more competitive economy. That's the only way we're going to earn more revenue. It's the only way we're going to get investment. And if you add more and more rules on who you can do business with, how many you have to do business with, local companies, Black firms, women-headed firms, veteran-headed firms, there's a long list that you have to comply with. We think this is going to add to the cost of doing business and will make this a less competitive economy. So we don't buy that pillar. His second pillar is infrastructure. And again, who could be opposed to infrastructure? But this is much harder than it sounds. The state doesn't have money to build infrastructure. They need private investment. You have to manage that carefully. And you have to create the conditions in which private investors want to risk their money. You have to decide what kind of infrastructure we can afford, because you need a revenue stream. And what kind of infrastructure will help South Africa grow much faster? So this is obviously an important area. It's not a silver bullet. A lot of the issues are not yet resolved. And this is only one part of how South Africa can grow. The state is going to have to change quite dramatically in order to engage effectively with the private sector and get the kind of investment that we need. Well, energy, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I suppose the only thing to say is, why don't you get a move on already? There have been some reforms introduced, but we have a massive debt at Eskom and no plan yet as to how to deal with that. We have a Minister of Minerals and Energy who is reluctant to introduce the kinds of reforms that almost every expert in the country is calling for. And although the president surprised everyone by saying that we could have 100 megawatts of self-generated energy, which would be good and would increase infrastructure investment and increase energy security, it remains to be seen how fast the regulations will be introduced to deal with this and how enthusiastically the reluctant ministry will implement this. So there are many issues around energy before we can say we have the energy we need to grow. Never mind all the blackouts most of us have to deal with. The next pillar, the president talked about reforms for growth. I am absolutely in favor of reform. And I support his introduction of the Operation Vulindlela between his office in the presidency and the National Treasury to try and push reluctant ministers to actually implement reform. But the truth is that a number of the reforms he was talking about in 2018 have still not been implemented. And some of them are not very hard. This was not a very ambitious agenda. E-visas for tourists when we get some post-COVID. Well, we haven't done that yet. Ethiopia has it, but we haven't done that. Why? It's never very clear. Why not? So the reforms for growth are absolutely essential. I think my list would differ from the president's, but he hasn't even completed his list yet, and it's certainly not going to be finished before the end of this year. So a very slow approach to reform. Now, part of his strategy was employment, absolutely vital. And what he proposed was 800,000 jobs to be paid for by public money to provide mainly young people with employment in this terrible time of COVID and the consequences it's had for employment. It's not clear about 400 to 500,000 temporary part-time jobs have been created with public money. And I personally am not convinced about this strategy, but the jury is out and we await an evaluation of this. Some 300,000 young people were paid the minimum wage or more and sort of put into our schools, many of which were closed at the time. So I am confused about this approach to jobs. But the most important question is this. Why do you put your faith in the state to create jobs when we know that it's firms and markets and entrepreneurs that create millions and millions of jobs? And that's the real priority for South Africa. So I'm really one of those people who says, I'm afraid that I don't think the government's strategy for reform and recovery is going to work. We're not going to get the growth that we need. And we need to fundamentally rethink how we get much faster and more inclusive growth in this society. Not just growth, but much more labor-intensive growth is required. And so I would argue, especially after the terrible events in July, I think there were traitors in the ANC and in the state. And I think it was, whatever you want to call it, the president called it an insurrection. I think he's probably right. But the fact is that many people were involved in looting because I think they have no hope for the future. Of course, there were richer people who also looted. And that's partly because we have a culture of lawlessness and impunity for looting that stretches right up to the cabinet. So we've had a terrible July. And I think it has driven the country to even more of a precipice, if I can mix my metaphors, than before. And in this circumstance, I think the president has to act much more boldly than hitherto. He has to stamp his authority on government, on his cabinet. He has to stamp his authority on his party. Now, yes, he has introduced some reforms in the last 3.5 years. It would be wrong to ignore that. And yes, Jacob Zuma is in jail. And this is a big achievement. But the reforms that have been introduced are too little to give a big signal to investors that this is a country in which to risk your money. It's too little to give hope to millions and millions and millions of young people who cannot see where they can get employment, many of whom come out of terrible schools. We pay a lot of money for our teachers, and our education budget is proportionately one of the highest in the developing world. But we don't get value for money. And most of the kids in our schools do not learn and do not get the kind of education, just basics, reading, writing, and basic numeracy that you need in order, at minimum, to get a job. So I think the president has to move up a gear, or at least 5 gears, I would say. He's got to act boldly, and he has to put South Africa's interests first, way ahead of ANC unity. What does he have to do? Well, I think a reforming president must lead. He should stop talking about endless compacts. Yes, consultation is fine. But in a situation where you have to deal with vested interests, reformers have to move fast. They have to take on vested interests, from the corrupt to those who benefit from the structure of our society today. And he has to introduce reforms so he can get new friends, new beneficiaries very fast. He has to also dominate the narrative in the country. What is the story we can tell each other and our children about how South Africa is moving forward and going to provide jobs, prosperity, and inclusion? So I think the president has to first and foremost deal with the security cluster. We have a useless police department. We have a compromised National Commissioner of Police. We have a defense minister who disagrees with the president about what happened in July. And we have national security intelligence, which didn't seem to provide anyone with any intelligence. Now, whether they're divided, incompetent, corrupt, or part of the instigation of insurrection, we don't know. But the president needs to reassure the country and fast that he is dealing with the security cluster, and some heads must roll, some big heads. So security is now a very important issue. When the president came into power in 2018, he appointed a committee to look into this. They reported in December 2018 that there were big allegations of all sorts of terrible things, a captured security cluster, but he did not act. He has to act now. He has to get a new team around him in the cabinet, senior directors general and below, a team that are committed to the Constitution and are seized with the necessity to deliver results. Let me say something. I see I'm running out of time. I'm going to say something about business nationally and then yourselves regionally. So I think business nationally has a really important role to play in a society in crisis. I think they should stop cheerleading. They should stop supporting Band-Aids. They should say in public what they discuss around their dinner tables. And they should be much more strategic about how to approach South Africa's many challenges. I don't have time to go into all of that. What can you do as a regional agricultural, commercial agricultural organization? The first thing I would say is you should make your voice heard loud and clear in Limpopo, with every politician in Limpopo, with the premier and with top officials. The truth is that commercial agriculture, big and small, is the only real capacity in rural South Africa. I don't say that lightly, and that has enormous consequences. Our largest agricultural companies, many in your region, are integrated into global value chains. This is very unusual in the developing world, and it's great. We need more of this. We need support for that. And we need Black inclusion both in terms of farmers who must succeed. We need a Black commercial farming class, but also in terms of workers, how they're treated and how we can encourage labor intensity rather than more and more and more machines. The labor market rules must change. You should say this loudly and clearly. When it comes to land reform, you should say loudly that we must not change the Constitution. This is the worst possible signal to investors, and domestic and foreign. Land reform is absolutely vital. I am in favor of faster land reform, but what holds it back is not anything to do with the Constitution or the ability to expropriate land with nil compensation. What holds it back is the capacity of the state to implement something without corruption and effectively, and at all levels of government. You should publicize what many farmers are doing already to implement land reform, to bring in Black farmers and into their value chains and into their business. Publicize that. And lastly, the country needs a rural development strategy that is economically based. We've never had one. We've done terrible things to rural people, but we've never had a serious, rational, economic rural strategy for the country, and we need one. And then lastly, there are many, many young people in your region and the rest of the country's rural areas who just have no hope of a future. And we have to stop doing small little projects and start shouting at the politicians about the legislative and other changes that are required in order to grow faster and grow much more labor intensively. So let me end then by saying that societies in trouble need organized citizens. And the reaction of many of us with the circumstances in our country is to retreat to the private realm and say, oh, there's nothing we can do. But in fact, this is when we have to organize and get involved and shout loudly in the public square much more than ever before. There is a lot at stake here. Our country is in deep trouble, but I think it can be turned around. And your organization has an important role to play, and you should not be subtle about what you think should happen in your region or the country, but make it crystal clear what rules must change, what regulations, what laws, and how the country can move forward and grow and include more and more of almost 50% of our population that is excluded and lives in poverty. Thank you very much for this opportunity.